In this class we want to talk about comparative advantage. Now this video should be seen in conjunction with other videos with similar titles, other videos on the topic of comparative advantage. In particular, some of those give a more rigorous proof as to why comparative advantage works. In this one I want to set out the scene and talk in general terms about some of the issues associated with comparative advantage. So we're here dealing with international trade and the principle which underpins international trade, comparative advantage. Now, the idea was first popularized by David Ricardo in his book in 1817, a book called On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Ricardo sets out the idea of comparative advantage and makes the argument that specialization in different countries will lead to mutual advantage, and therefore free trade is to be encouraged. He gave an example of England trading with Portugal. Now I'm going to go through this example. It's quite slow going because it's a very old example, and I'm trying to stick with what Ricardo set out. So it's not a proof. As I said, look to other videos for the proof of comparative advantage and for the logic of comparative advantage. In this case we're looking at what Ricardo set out about the example he used, which was between England and Portugal. Now Portugal, well, it produces both wine and cloth, let's say. And let's also say that with less labour than it would take to produce the same quantities in England. So both are easily produced in Portugal. So in other words, the Portuguese, let's say, can produce cloth cheaper than England and can also produce wine cheaper than England. Therefore, it seems to be the case, very simplistically, that Portugal does not need England to trade, because Portugal can produce both items cheaper than England. However, the relative cost of producing those two goods are different in the two countries. So if you look at England, the cost of wine in terms of cloth will be different to the cost of wine in comparison to cloth in Portugal. So in England, it's difficult to produce wine and only moderately difficult to produce cloth. In other words, we've got an example here in which England is inefficient compared to Portugal. This is the original example. Now, Portugal again. Well, it's cheaper to produce cloth in Portugal than in England, and it's cheaper still to produce wine or excess wine and trade that for English cloth. So the argument here is that Portugal, even though it's cheaper to make cloth in Portugal, it's even better for the Portuguese to make wine and then trade the wine with England in exchange for cloth. Conversely, England benefits from this trade because its cost for producing cloth has not changed, but it can now get wine at a lower price, closer to the cost of cloth. So in other words, England benefits. England is now producing cloth, let's say, so it can export its excess to Portugal and get wine in return. So England is better off. The conclusion drawn is that each country can gain by specializing in the good where it has comparative advantage and trading that good for the other. So in other words, Portugal would look to see what is it most efficient at, growing wine or making cloth. Let's say it's the most efficient at making wine. So it concentrates all its efforts at making wine. In England, it's very difficult to produce wine, so it's almost out of the question because of the climate. But the English can make cloth. Therefore, The English specialize in cloth and the Portuguese specialize in wine, and they trade. And in this way, both countries get even more of the product. So the comparative advantage means they're able to specialize on that product with which they are most efficient. Comparative advantage exists when a country has a margin of superiority in the production of a good or service. For example, where the opportunity cost of production is lower. So when countries work out their opportunity costs, which items should they produce? Should they concentrate all their efforts in one area or produce several areas? And when they get down to working out what they should do, what they should focus on, if all the countries do it and trade their surpluses, then the countries will be better off. They are focusing on the areas where they have a comparative advantage over the other countries. It explains how trade can create value for the two countries, even when one can produce all the goods with fewer resources than the other. The example I just gave was, in the example, Portugal was more efficient at producing wine and cloth, but it was still worthwhile specializing and trading the surplus. It was still advantageous to focus the efforts on one product, trade the surplus, and the other country do the same, and both would be better off. The net benefits of such an outcome are called the gains from trade. Now, Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage was further developed by Heckscher, Olin, and Samuelson, who argued that countries have different factor endowments of labour, land, and capital input, and they should concentrate on production where they have got an abundance of a resource. So it enables them to maximize the benefits of specialization and hence, of course, of trade. Countries will specialize in the export of those goods which use intensively the factors of production with which they are most endowed. So countries will specialize and export those products which use intensively the factors of production which are most endowed. So if a country has got a surplus of labour, perhaps a skilled labour force, and it's got many workers, then it will focus in on labour intensive production, and it'll export products with a high labour input. So that's the argument. If a country has a lot of land, it'll focus in perhaps on agricultural products or forestry products and so on. If each country specializes in those products and services where they have an advantage, then total output and economic welfare can be increased under certain assumptions. So if each country specializes in those goods and services where they have an advantage, and because they specialize, they trade off their surpluses, that is when the advantages of trade, the gains from trade, can be realized. This is true even if one nation has an absolute advantage over the other, as in the case of, I mentioned earlier, Portugal. The example we took, Portugal was more efficient at producing cloth and wine, and yet it was best for the Portuguese to specialize in wine production, the British to specialize in cloth, and trade with each other. There was a better outcome. Now, take this example, pre-specialization, cloth and wine. So let's say the UK can produce 2,000 units of cloth and 500 units of wine, Portugal 4,000 and so on. So the total output of cloth, if there are just two countries, is 6,000 units of cloth and 2,500 units of wine. To identify which country should specialize in a particular product, we need to analyze the internal opportunity cost of each country. So we need to look at these figures in a little more detail. For example, if the UK shifts more resources into wine production, the opportunity cost of each extra unit of wine would be 4 units of cloth. If you look at the table, to get one more unit of wine for the UK, it'll have to give up 4 units of cloth. For Portugal, the same decision has an opportunity cost of 2 units of cloth. The Portuguese will just have to give up 2 units of cloth to get an extra unit of wine. The UK will have to give up 4 units. So there are different opportunity costs. Therefore, Portugal has a comparative advantage in wine production. It only requires 2 units of cloth compared with the 4 from the UK. So it's best, therefore, that Portugal specialises in wine. It has a lower opportunity cost. If the UK shifts more resources into cloth production, the opportunity cost of each unit of cloth will be a quarter unit of wine. So if it's going to produce one more unit of cloth, it just has to give up a quarter unit of wine, because it's 500 divided by 2,000. For Portugal, the same decision has an opportunity cost of a half wine. Well, it's 2,000 divided by 4,000. Therefore, the UK has a comparative advantage in cloth production. So now we've worked it out. Portugal has the advantage in wine, the UK has the advantage in cloth. Now, specialisation and the gains from trade. After specialisation, the UK would make cloth, and Portugal would step up its production of wine. If the UK specialises in cloth, it will give up the 500 units of wine and gain 2,000 units of cloth. If Portugal gives up 1,600 units of cloth, it will gain 800 units of wine. This means the total output of cloth has increased by 2,000 units, and total output of wine has expanded by 800 units. So by specialising, if you like, this little world economy, this world economy of just 2 countries, is now richer. It's got more wine and it's got more cloth. Output of both products has increased, representing a gain in economic welfare. That's the advantages of free trade. Now, allocating the gains from trade. Well, for mutually beneficial trade to take place, the 2 countries have to agree an acceptable rate of exchange of one product for the other. So the countries have to agree on what the exchange rate is of one product for the other. To work this out, consider the internal opportunity cost ratios for each country. So, pre-specialisation, we have that situation one we met earlier. And after specialisation, we have this relationship. We met this earlier as well. At terms of trade, or if you like the exchange rate in this case, of 3 units of cloth for each unit of wine may be agreed. So let's say 3 units of cloth. It falls in between the 2, what Portugal had as their rate and what the UK had. So let's say 3. So after trade, the UK trade 1,800 units of cloth for 600 units of wine. So if you like, 3C equals 1W. 3 cloth equals 1 wine. So for the UK has given up its wine production. It's got, let's say, 4,000 units of cloth. It trades 1,800, leaving 2,200 on the bottom table. So it trades 1,800, got 2,200 left. The 800 it trades gets 600 bottles of wine. Well, that's more wine than it had before. So now the UK, after trade, has got more cloth. It's got an extra 200 units of cloth. And it's got 600 bottles of wine. It previously had 500. So the UK has done well out of trade. Now for Portugal, let's say the Portuguese trade 600 units of wine for 1,800 units of cloth. Portugal can produce 2,800, let's say, 600 units of wine. It trades the 600 units of wines for 1,800 units of cloth. So the 600 comes off the 2,800 it's producing after specialization. If we look at the table after specialization, Portugal was producing 2,800 units of wine. That's gone down now to 2,200 on the bottom table. And it's got an extra 1,800 units of cloth. So add the 1,800 units of cloth to the 2,400, giving you 4,200 units of cloth. In other words, Portugal is now better off as well. Portugal originally had 4,000 units of cloth. Now it's got 6,400. Portugal originally had 2,000 units of wine. Now it's got 2,200 units of wine. So by specializing and looking at this example, both countries are better off. They have specialized in production. They've looked at where their comparative advantage is and focused in on that and just produced that item and traded the balance. So the total amount of goods available to consumers in both countries has grown. The UK's consumption of cloth has increased by 200 units, and they have an extra 100 units of wine. For Portugal, they have an extra 200 units of cloth and 200 units of wine. Now, the assumptions underlying the concept of comparative advantage. Well, for a start, there must be perfect occupational mobility of the factors of production. Resources used in one industry can be switched into another without any loss of efficiency. That's not very realistic, but its violation will simply detract from the power of the theory. It doesn't invalidate the theory, it simply may reduce the gains from trade. It's difficult to take mine workers and make them become carpenters, or take carpenters and make them become computer engineers. So the retraining and switching people over in occupations is very difficult and will absorb a lot of resources. There are also constant returns to scale. For example, doubling inputs in each country leads to a doubling of total output. Well, whether there's constant returns to scale or not is an issue. If we double inputs in industry, we may get less than double the output. There might be diseconomies of scale because the companies are too big or not completely familiar with the production, or there could be some issues with management or whatever. Or there might be economies of scale. So having a constant return to scale is also a restricted assumption. And no externalities arising from production and or consumption. So there's no external costs here. There's no damage, significant damage to the environment or to people's health, or there's nothing to detract from the benefits of the trade. And of course, we don't count transport costs, which of course we should. We didn't count the transport costs in the trade between Portugal and England. It didn't get mentioned in any of the tables. Clearly it should, because the wine and the cloth have to be transported. So these take away from the gains from trade, the advantages of trade. If business exploit increasing returns to scale, for example economies of scale, when they specialize, the potential gains from trade will be much greater. So the assumption was constant returns to scale, but if it was increasing returns to scale, there would be a lot more advantage. So comparative advantage is a dynamic concept. It's one related to time, it's changing, it's constantly under review. Governments look ahead, try to assess where trade can be profitably conducted and so on. It can and does change over time. The advantages can change over time. Working practices change. The skills in the labour force change. There's new technology coming in and so on. So the patterns of trade are difficult to predict using traditional and very restrictive models like comparative advantage. We still know comparative advantage. The mathematics of it makes sense. The logic of it makes sense. But it's just very difficult to work out in today's increasingly sophisticated and complex world. Some businesses find that they have enjoyed a comparative advantage in one product for several years, only to face increasing competition as rival producers from other countries enter their markets. So all the time the patterns of trade are changing as new producers enter into production and costs are different and the opportunity costs in different countries are changing all the time. So the patterns of trade change with it. For a country, the following factors are important in determining relative costs of production. The quantity and quality of factors of production available, e.g. the size and efficiency of the available labour force and the productivity of the existing stock of capital inputs. Clearly the skills of the population are important, and clearly the mobility of the population is important, as I said earlier, so that the quantity and quality of factors of production available determine the relative costs of production within countries. So how many workers are there with appropriate skills? What is the capital endowments of the economy? How much land's available? Is it an enterprising economy? And so on. These will determine the productivity and production and relative cost of production within a country. If an economy can improve the quality of its labour force and increase the stock of capital available, it can expand the productive potential in industries in which it has the advantage. So if an economy can improve the quality of labour through training and education, let's say, and also increase the stock of capital, then of course it can increase its productive potential and further enhance the trading opportunities that it has. Investment in research and development is important in many industries. And also, it's one where patents, or if you like patents, give some firms significant market advantage. So a company engages in research and development and is able to protect that research and development for some time and enable it to perhaps gain economies of scale and engage in production. Of course, movements in the exchange rate also determine relative costs of production. When the exchange rate moves, if the exchange rate increases, for example, then imports become cheaper, exports become more expensive. So the constant move in the exchange rate with the floating exchange rate means the cost of production in the international market will be changing. The cost of the items will change, and that will appear to be the same as changes in the cost of production. It's as if the country was inefficient, perhaps, and it's simply caused by a movement in the exchange rate. An appreciation of the exchange rate can cause imports of a country to increase in price, as I just said. This makes them less competitive in international markets. So companies can become less competitive in international markets simply because the exchange rate has moved, let's say, upwards. So the company finds it difficult to export. Long-term rates of inflation compared to other countries is also a problem. When domestic prices are rising, the costs of the items are rising on the domestic market, it's difficult to sell overseas. Unless there is a countervailing movement in the exchange rate to balance the rate of inflation. But in the absence of that, companies can start to lose markets because of high rates of inflation, high rates of price increase. For example, if average inflation in country X is 4%, whilst in country B it is 8% over a number of years, the goods and services produced by country X will become relatively more expensive over time. So country X here, their items will become relatively more expensive. But that's if the rate of inflation in B is reduced. So if the average rate of inflation in country X is 4% over a particular time period, and in B it's 8%, initially country B is going to lose out because it has the higher rate of inflation. But if that tapers off and country X continues with a rate of inflation of, let's say, 4%, the goods and services produced by country X will then become relatively more expensive over time. So just to say that the average inflation rate is 4% and 8% for a number of years is fine, but what happens to it into the future? If country B, let's say, got its inflation under control, country A continued at 4%, perhaps country X therefore would become uncompetitive. This worsens their competitiveness and causes a switch in comparative advantage. So changes in the rate of inflation can change the pattern of trade, and of course the advantages of comparative advantage may be lost. Import controls such as tariffs and quotas can be used to create an artificial comparative advantage for a country's domestic producers, although most countries agree to abide by international trade agreements. Certainly in the past, countries were keen to protect their industry and protect their workforce and so on. So they would have tariffs against imports. They would also have quotas. So there were obstacles to trade. Clearly, if there are obstacles to trade, trade is reduced or perhaps even becomes non-existent, in which case there are no advantages to trade. There are no gains from trade. Also, non-price competitiveness of producers, product design, reliability, quality, after sales support. Non-price competitiveness could be an issue as well. Some companies are very good at having after-sales service and gain significant sales as a consequence. Other companies are not so good. And the ones who are good may go on to become quite dominant in international trade. And therefore, there are advantages to the country from gains from trade. There's more international trade and perhaps more opportunities for each country to specialize a little more. This is a general discussion about comparative advantage, giving some straightforward examples and some ideas about what determines the gains from trade and how countries trade, and what are the obstacles to trade, and what factors are important in determining relative costs of production between two countries. But that's all we're going to deal with in this session. So we're going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.